My father, 55 years ago last month, I sat as a 14-year-old boy behind my father as he announced in the Senate caucus room in Washington, D.C., his campaign for presidency of the United States. And my father at that time was in many ways in the same position that I'm in today. He was running against a president of his own party. He was running against a war. He was running at a time of unprecedented polarization in our country. And he had no chance of winning. My father, when he declared, had not a single molecule in him that he believed that he could win the Democratic nomination. Why is that? He had run his brother's campaign in 1960, 8 years before. But now, all the unions were against him with two exceptions, the United Auto Workers and Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. The liberal press was 100% against him, from the New York Times to the Village Voice. The big city mayors were against him, including Mayor Daley, who had played a critical role in President Kennedy's nomination. All of the people in the New Frontier, who were his closest friends, were now working for the Johnson White House, so they were against him. The only people that he had with him, even the universities were against him, because they were with McCarthy, the group of Hollywood, like Joanne Woodward, Paul Newman, who had been very close to him, worked very hard for my uncle in '60, were now working for McCarthy. And my father used to say that McCarthy had all the A students and he had the B and C students. And so the only people he had were people, poor white people in rural areas like Appalachia, poor blacks in the Delta, and in our cities in Watts and Harlem, and East LA, and Indians on the Indian reservations, and that was kind of it. But that hopelessness in his campaign freed him to tell the truth to the American people. So when he went to Indiana University and the medical students said to him, "Who's going to pay for your health care program?" He said, "You are." And when he went to Creighton University, which was a Catholic university in Omaha, and they asked him whether he would support their deferments, he said no. The deferments were the reason most of them were in college, because that was the only way you could get out of Vietnam. And he said no, and they booed him. And he said, "Do you think it's fair that 45% of paratroopers in Vietnam are black? Do you think it's fair that we are sending black children to fight this war because they can't get their kids into college?" He said, "I can get my 10 kids into college and get them out of the war if I want to. But do you think that that is consistent with your Catholic values at this university?" And when he ended, they gave him a standing ovation. When he went to Watts and he talked about the importance to the black community of abiding with the law, they applauded him. When he went to the University of Alabama, which he had forcibly integrated by federalizing the National Guard with United States troops 5 years before, he talked to them about the enduring importance of civil rights. They applauded him. When he went to the University of Kansas and gave a speech to 20,000 people, the kids in the auditorium, who were all corn-fed, Midwestern, pro-military, pro-Vietnam, and he talked to them for an hour about the progression of the Vietnam War. And at the end of that, the applause was so thunderous that Jack Newfield, who was one of the reporters who was with him that time, said it felt like the roof was coming off of the auditorium. The students rushed the stage. They were throwing chairs. They just wanted to hear the truth. That's it. And the day he died, he won the California primary, the most urban state in this country, and the same day, the South Dakota primary, the most rural. He had succeeded in uniting America and building that bridge just by telling people the truth. Oh, I was with my dad when he died in Los Angeles, and we brought him back to New York on Vice President Humphrey's plane on US-2, and we waked him at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And then we brought him from Penn Station in New York to Union Station in Washington, D.C. Normally that's a 2.5-hour train ride, but it took us 7.5 hours because there were 2 million people on the tracks. I will never forget, as a 14-year-old boy, what I saw from the windows of that train that day. In all of the urban train stations in Trenton and Newark and Philadelphia and Baltimore, they were crowded with black and white men singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the countryside, there were white people in military uniforms. There were blacks. There were rabbis and priests. I remember in Delaware there were 7 nuns standing in the back of a yellow pickup truck, just waving handkerchiefs at us as we passed. We saw, I remember passing a Little League game where all of the kids on both sides, both teams, the coaches, and all the spectators in the stand were standing with their hands at their hearts in salute. We saw Boy Scout troops saluting, military officers and personnel, hippies in tie-dye T-shirts, with mothers holding up babies. Many of them had American flags. Many of them had signs that said, "Goodbye, Bobby," or "Pray for us, Bobby." And we got to Union Station in Washington, and President Johnson met us there. And we drove my father's body up past the mall in Washington. And 3 months earlier, my father had communicated with Martin Luther King, and they decided to partner with Marion Wright Edelman, who was one of my father's aides, to organize. They saw that the Vietnam War was destroying the war on poverty. It was sucking all the money, and Johnson essentially had to pull the plug on the war on poverty. And my father told Martin, the poor are never going to get rights in this country until they start politically participating. Let's do a poor people's campaign like we did 5 years before with the Civil Rights Campaign. Bring them all to Washington. So all of these men, thousands of men, were encamped in plastic shanties on the mall. Martin had died, a month or a month and a half earlier. Now my father was dead. And we drove up past them. They all came to the sidewalk, and they held their hats against their chests in a salute and bowed their heads as we took my father up the hill across the bridge to Arlington to bury him under a simple stone next to his brother. And 4 years later, I was studying here at college, American history, and I came across demographic data that showed that most of those white people who had lined that train track and who had supported my father in the primary in 1968, 4 years later in 1972, they voted not for George McGovern, who was very closely aligned with my dad, but instead for George Wallace, who was an ardent segregationist, who was antithetical to everything my father believed in. And it occurred to me then, and it struck me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side, and that the easiest thing for a politician to do is to appeal to our anger and our bigotry and our hatred and our greed and all the lower angels, the darker angels of our character. And that once in a while we get a political leader who tries to do successfully what my dad did, which is to talk to people in a way that gets them to transcend their narrow self-interest, gets them to transcend their fear and their bigotry and their anger, and see themselves as part of a community, sees themselves as part of a noble experiment, and helps them to find the hero that we all have in each of us. And my father tried to persuade people that we have to avoid the seduction of the notion that we can advance ourselves as a people by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind, or that the only way we can get security is to get rid of our constitutional rights. And he tried to remind Americans that we each need to be a hero, and he succeeded in doing that. And his trail, unfortunately, was cut short.